My mom texted me at midnight with hands so shaky she could barely type. The message said, "Don't come home. He's waiting for you." I asked who she was talking about. She replied with 4 words that made my heart stop. "The man from your past." 10 minutes later, SWAT teams surrounded our family home, and I realized the nightmare I thought I'd escaped 7 years ago had found me again. My name is Autumn Reed. I'm 26 years old, and I work as a paralegal at a small law firm in Portland, Oregon. The man who broke into my parents' house that night was Damian Cross, my ex-boyfriend from 7 years ago, who never accepted that our relationship was over. My mom, Linda, is 54 and works as an elementary school librarian. My dad, Greg, is 56 and works in construction. My younger brother, Connor, was 22 at the time, finishing his senior year of college. Detective Maria Santos was the lead officer who talked me through the worst night of my life. If you want to know how I survived a hostage situation created by someone I dated when I was a teenager, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because this story will show you that some people never let go. I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Portland. I saved for 2 years to afford it, and I'm proud of the independence it represents. My life is quiet, structured, and safe. That's exactly how I designed it after getting out of a controlling relationship when I was 19. I'm close with my family, especially Connor. We text almost every day, and I visit my parents every Sunday for dinner at their house in the suburbs. I'm careful about dating. My friends think I'm too guarded and don't put myself out there enough, but they don't know the full story of what I went through with Damian. I met Damian Cross when I was 18 and just starting my first year of college. He was 25 and worked at a coffee shop near campus. He seemed mature and interesting compared to the guys my age. He paid attention to me in ways that felt special and made me feel like I mattered. We dated for 8 months, and during that time, everything slowly changed. He started asking where I was all the time. He wanted to know who I was with and what I was doing every minute. He'd get upset if I didn't respond to texts fast enough. He criticized what I wore and who my friends were. When I tried to break up with him the first time, he showed up at my dorm at 3 in the morning crying and saying he'd hurt himself if I left him. I felt guilty and took him back. The second time I tried to leave, he followed me everywhere. He'd wait outside my classes, show up at my parents' house, send me hundreds of messages a day. Finally, with my parents' help, I got a restraining order against him. He violated it twice by showing up at places he knew I'd be. Then one day, he just disappeared. I heard from mutual friends that he'd left Portland. For 7 years, I heard nothing from him. I thought I was free. The night everything changed started completely normal. It was a Friday, and I'd worked late finishing up case files at the law firm. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, made myself dinner, and watched a show on my couch. Around 11, I texted with Connor about his plans after graduation. I got ready for bed, brushed my teeth, plugged in my phone, and turned off all the lights. I was almost asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up the dark room. It was exactly midnight. I figured it was Connor sending me something random like he usually did. I picked up my phone and saw it was from my mom. My mom never texted this late, ever. Something was immediately wrong. The message said, "Don't come home tonight, please, he's waiting for you." The text had typos and the words were uneven, like her hands had been shaking while she typed. I sat straight up in bed, suddenly wide awake. I called her immediately, but it went to voicemail. I texted back, "Mom, what's happening? Who's waiting? Are you okay?" I watched the 3 dots appear, showing she was typing. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. Finally, another message came through that made my blood run cold. "The man from your past. Damian. He's here. He broke in. He has pictures of you everywhere. Your bedroom. Don't come here." I threw off my blankets and started getting dressed with shaking hands. I texted back frantically, "Did you call the police? Where's Dad? Where's Connor? Are you safe?" No response. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice, then nothing but silence. I called 911 while pulling on jeans and a sweatshirt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I could barely hold the phone steady enough to talk. When the dispatcher answered, I told her that someone had broken into my parents' house and was holding them there. I gave her the address and tried to explain about the restraining order from 7 years ago, about Damien Cross, about the terrified texts from my mother. The dispatcher asked if I was safe where I was, and told me to stay in my apartment with all doors and windows locked. She said police were being dispatched to my parents' house immediately, and that she needed me to stay on the line. She started asking questions about Damien's history, whether he'd ever been physically violent, whether he owned any weapons. I realized I was crying while trying to answer her. The truth was I had no idea if Damien had weapons. I had no idea what he'd been doing for the past 7 years. I had no idea why he'd suddenly come back into my life now after all this time. After I finished with the 911 dispatcher, I tried calling my dad's phone. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I tried Connor's number next. It rang twice and then went to voicemail, like someone had actively declined the call. That meant Connor was awake and had his phone in his hand but couldn't or wouldn't answer. My stomach turned. I tried my mom's phone one more time. This time, someone picked up after 1 ring, but it wasn't my mother's voice. It was a man's voice, one I recognized instantly even after 7 years of silence. Damien said my name slowly, drawing it out like he was savoring it. He said he'd missed me so much and that my mom was very worried about me. He said my dad was worried too, and Connor was there as well. He said they were all just waiting for me to come home where I belonged. His voice was calm and gentle, which somehow made it 1,000 times more terrifying than if he'd been yelling. I forced myself to ask if my family was okay. Damien said they were fine for now, but that they really wanted to see me. Then he asked if I didn't want to see them too. Before I could answer, I heard my mother's voice in the background. She sounded muffled and like she was crying. Then the line went completely dead. I stood frozen in the middle of my apartment, feeling pure panic take over my body. Damien had broken into my parents' house. He was holding my entire family hostage. He was using them as bait to get to me. I ran to my window and looked down at the street below. Everything looked normal and quiet at first. But then I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen in the neighborhood before. As I watched, the interior light flickered on for just a second, showing a person sitting in the driver's seat. They were facing my building, watching. I stepped back from the window fast. Damien wasn't just at my parents' house 20 minutes away. He had someone stationed outside my apartment to make sure I didn't run or do something unexpected. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother's number, but I knew it was Damien sending it. The message said that police were probably on their way to my parents' house, and that I'd been smart to call them. But then it said that the moment he saw police lights, something very bad was going to happen to my family, to my mom, my dad, and my baby brother. It said I didn't want that. Then it told me exactly what to do. I was supposed to get in my car and drive to my parents' house. When I arrived, I had to walk in the front door alone. Then we were going to talk about us, about our future, about all the things we should have discussed 7 years ago before I ruined everything by leaving him. Another text came through immediately after. It said I had 20 minutes. If I wasn't there by then, he would start with Connor. My phone rang with an unknown number. I answered, and it was a police officer calling from near my parents' house. He said his name was Sergeant Walsh, and that they had units positioned around the property. They'd confirmed through windows that there were people inside but hadn't made contact yet. He asked if I'd received any communication from inside the house. I told him everything, reading the texts word for word with a voice that kept breaking. There was a heavy pause on the other end. Then, Sergeant Walsh told me they were bringing in a hostage negotiation team and a SWAT unit because this was now an active hostage situation. He said under absolutely no circumstances should I go to that house. He said Damien was trying to draw me there so he'd have complete control over all of us. He told me to stay exactly where I was and to stay on the line with him, but I was barely listening to anything he said. All I could think about was Connor, 22 years old with his whole future ahead of him, and Damien's threat repeating in my head over and over. I start with Connor. I looked at the clock on my phone. 15 minutes had already passed since Damien's first text. Sergeant Walsh was still talking on the phone, explaining protocols and negotiation procedures, and how these situations typically unfold. He was telling me that trained professionals were handling this, and that the worst thing I could do was get involved. But all I could hear was the timer counting down in my head. 5 minutes left until Damien said he'd hurt Connor. I told Sergeant Walsh I understood everything and that I'd stay in my apartment like he instructed. Then I hung up before he could say anything else. I grabbed my car keys, my phone, and the small canister of pepper spray I kept in my purse. I left my apartment through the back stairwell instead of the main elevator, hoping whoever was watching from the dark sedan wouldn't notice. I made it to the parking garage and got into my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I knew this was probably the most dangerous and stupid decision I'd ever made in my life, but I also knew I couldn't live with myself if something happened to my family, because I played it safe. I drove through empty midnight streets, gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands ached. I tried calling Sergeant Walsh back, but he didn't answer, probably dealing with the chaos at the scene. I called the main police dispatch line and told them I was Autumn Reed, and I was driving to the hostage situation at my parents' house, even though I'd been told not to come. The dispatcher sounded alarmed and said I needed to turn around immediately. I said I couldn't let Damien hurt my family and that I was about 10 minutes away. She started trying to transfer me to the commanding officer on scene. While I waited on hold, another text came through from Damien. It said he was tracking my phone and could see I was on my way. It said I was making the smart choice, and that this was the Autumn he remembered, always trying to save everyone. It said my family was going to be so relieved to see me. As I got closer to my parents' neighborhood, I started seeing police cars parked on side streets with their lights turned off. When I finally turned onto my parents' street, I saw the full scale of what was happening. There had to be at least a dozen police vehicles, an armored SWAT truck, and officers in tactical gear positioned behind cars, and trees. Massive spotlights were aimed at my parents' house, lighting it up like a stage. The entire street had been blocked off, and I could see neighbors being kept behind yellow tape at the far end of the block. An officer stepped into the street and signaled for me to stop. I rolled down my window and said my name. The officer's eyes went wide, and he immediately spoke into his radio. Within seconds, a woman wearing a police vest jogged over to my car. She introduced herself as Detective Maria Santos and asked me very firmly to please pull to the side and step out of my vehicle. Detective Santos walked me behind the police perimeter to a large command van where several people were monitoring computers and radio equipment. A man in civilian clothes with a police badge on his belt turned around and looked frustrated when he saw me. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Hayes, the hostage negotiator assigned to this situation. He said Damien had made contact about 10 minutes earlier, and his only demand was simple. He wanted me. Hayes said Damien claimed he wasn't armed, but they had no way to verify that. He said my mom, dad, and brother were being kept in the living room, away from windows. Hayes had been trying to build rapport with Damien and calm him down, but Damien kept insisting he would only speak to me. Hayes looked at me seriously and said they absolutely could not allow me to go inside that house. It violated every protocol and would put my life in immediate danger. But he wanted me to talk to Damien on the phone, to see if I could convince him to release my family and surrender peacefully. Hayes dialed my mother's cell phone number and put it on speaker so everyone in the command van could hear. Damien answered on the first ring. His voice actually brightened when Hayes told him Autumn was there and wanted to talk. Hayes handed me the phone, and I took a shaky breath before speaking. I said his name and told him I was there like he wanted. I asked him to please let my family go, because this was between him and me. Damien laughed softly and said it was so good to hear my voice after all this time. He said he'd been dreaming about this moment for 7 years. He said he'd followed my life from a distance, knew where I worked and lived, knew I'd never truly moved on from him, just like he'd never moved on from me. I felt sick listening to him, but forced myself to stay calm. I asked again for him to release my family. Damien said he would, but only if I came inside the house to talk to him face to face. He promised he just wanted to talk, to explain everything, to help me understand that we belonged together. Lieutenant Hayes was shaking his head at me firmly, signaling absolutely not. I looked around at Detective Santos, at Hayes, at all the heavily armed officers surrounding my childhood home. I thought about my family trapped inside with a man who'd never been able to accept rejection. I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I said into the phone that I would come inside, but only if he let Connor go first. Lieutenant Hayes reached for the phone, but I pulled it away from him. Damien went quiet on the other end, considering my offer. Then he said, okay, he'd send Connor out, but my parents had to stay with him until I was inside the house. He also said that if he saw any police officers trying to come in with me, if he saw any kind of trick or setup, he would hurt my parents. He asked if I understood. I said I understood completely. Hayes looked furious and started saying they couldn't allow this to happen. But Detective Santos put her hand on his arm and said quietly that if I could get the family out one at a time, they had to take that opportunity. 3 minutes later, the front door of my parents' house opened slowly. Connor stumbled out onto the porch with his hands raised, looking absolutely terrified. SWAT officers moved forward immediately and pulled him to safety behind the police line. I ran to him and threw my arms around him. He was shaking uncontrollably, saying over and over that Damien was completely insane. He said Damien had been sitting in my old bedroom for hours, looking at photos of me from high school, that he'd clearly been planning this for months. Connor grabbed my shoulders hard and said I couldn't go in there, that Damien wasn't stable, that something was seriously wrong with him. I hugged my brother tight and told him I loved him. Then I pulled away and started walking toward the house before anyone could physically stop me. Lieutenant Hayes called after me, saying this wasn't the agreement, and they hadn't authorized this. Detective Santos was speaking rapidly into her radio, coordinating with the SWAT team. I walked up the driveway I'd walked up thousands of times growing up, climbed the porch steps, and stood in front of the door. Through the window, I could see movement inside. The door opened from the inside, and there stood Damien Cross. He looked so different from 7 years ago. He was thinner, almost gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that radiated off him. But he smiled when he saw me, that same unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. I walked past him into my childhood home and heard the door close behind me with a sound like a coffin lid shutting. The living room looked surreal under the bright spotlights shining through the windows from outside. My parents were sitting on the couch, pressed close together. My mom was crying silently, and my dad had his arm around her protectively. Both of them looked exhausted and terrified. Damien pointed to the armchair across from them and told me to sit. I sat down slowly, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. He looked so different from my memories. He'd lost significant weight, and his hands kept moving constantly, fidgeting and twitching. He kept touching his jacket pockets, like he was checking for something. I forced my voice to stay calm and said I was here like he wanted, so now he needed to let my parents go so we could talk privately. Damien shook his head and said we were all going to talk together, like a family, because that's what we should have been all along if I hadn't thrown everything away 7 years ago. Damien started pacing back and forth, talking rapidly about the past 7 years. He said after the restraining order forced him to leave, he'd gone to California trying to forget me, but he couldn't do it. Everything reminded him of me. He lost jobs because he couldn't concentrate. He ruined relationships because no one compared to what we had. 3 months ago, he'd come back to Portland and started watching me from a distance. He knew my entire routine, where I bought coffee, what time I left for work, that I visited my parents every Sunday. He said he'd broken into my apartment twice while I was at work, just so he could be in my space. He pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures. Hundreds of them. Photos of me walking to my car, sitting in a cafe, leaving my office building, all taken without my knowledge over the past 3 months. I felt physically sick looking at them. Damien said he'd been planning tonight for weeks, waiting for the perfect time when my whole family would be together. Detective Santos's voice suddenly came through a bullhorn outside, asking Damien to pick up the phone so they could talk. Damien completely ignored her. I asked him as calmly as I could what he wanted from me. Damien stopped pacing and looked at me with desperate, wild eyes. He said he wanted me to understand that we belonged together, that the restraining order and the years apart were just temporary obstacles, and that if I'd just give him one more chance, we could leave Portland tonight and start fresh somewhere new. My dad spoke up for the first time, his voice hard, telling Damien he was delusional and needed professional help. Damien spun toward him, and that's when I saw it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, a hunting knife with at least a 6-inch blade. He pointed it at my father and told him to shut his mouth. My mother screamed. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering, and said Damien's name as firmly as I could. I realized in that moment that Damien didn't actually want to hurt anyone. What he wanted was me. If I could make him believe I was willing to listen, willing to really consider what he was saying, I might be able to get my parents out of that house safely. I took a slow breath and said his name again, softer this time. I told him I was there and I'd come because he asked me to, and that had to mean something. But I said my parents were terrified, and that was making it impossible for me to think clearly. I asked if he would let them go so we could talk alone, just the two of us like it used to be. Damien stared at me with the knife still in his hand, clearly trying to decide if I was telling the truth. He asked if I'd stay and promised not to run. I nodded and lied directly to his face, saying I'd stay and we could really talk. My father started to protest, but my mother squeezed his hand hard, understanding what I was trying to do. Damien walked slowly to the front door and opened it. He called out to the police that he was releasing my parents, but that I was staying voluntarily. My parents stood up carefully. My mom looked at me with tears streaming down her face, silently begging me to come with them. I gave her the smallest nod, trying to tell her without words that I had a plan. My parents walked past Damien and out the door. I watched through the window as officers rushed forward to pull them to safety. The door closed, and suddenly it was just me and Damien alone. The silence felt suffocating. Damien turned to me and smiled, looking almost relieved. He said it was finally just us, the way it should be. My mind was racing. I still had the pepper spray in my jacket pocket. The police were right outside. I just needed to keep him talking and buy time. I asked him to put the knife down so we could talk properly without anything between us. He looked at the knife like he'd forgotten he was holding it, then placed it on the coffee table, but close enough that he could grab it quickly. I started asking him questions about California, about his life, anything to keep him distracted and talking. Through the window, I could see shadows moving. The SWAT team was repositioning around the house. Damien was rambling about an apartment he'd rented and plans he'd made for us. I pretended to listen while watching for any signal from outside. Suddenly, there was a massive crash from the back of the house. Damien's head whipped around toward the sound. I lunged for the pepper spray in my pocket, but Damien was faster than I expected. He grabbed for the knife on the table. Before either of us could reach what we were going for, the front door exploded inward. SWAT officers in full tactical gear flooded into the room shouting commands. Damien reached for me, but I threw myself backward over the armchair. Officers tackled him to the ground before he could touch the knife. Within seconds, he was handcuffed and being dragged out of the house, screaming my name over and over. I sat on the floor behind the overturned chair, my whole body shaking violently. Detective Santos rushed in and knelt beside me, asking if I was hurt. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head. She helped me up and walked me outside where my entire family was waiting. Connor grabbed me first. Then my parents surrounded us, all of us crying and holding on to each other. Paramedics checked each of us while Damien was loaded into a police car, still screaming that I belonged to him. Detective Santos told us that Damien would be charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, aggravated stalking, and multiple other felonies. With his history and the restraining order violations, he was looking at decades in prison. Over the next few days, police searched Damien's apartment and found walls covered with hundreds of photos of me. He had journals documenting my daily routine going back months. He'd collected things from my trash and saved receipts from places I'd been. A psychiatrist determined he had erotomania, a disorder where someone believes another person is in love with them, despite all evidence showing otherwise. The restraining order hadn't stopped his obsession. It had only made it grow worse over 7 years. Damien's trial happened 9 months later. I had to testify and sit in a courtroom while he stared at me with that same intensity. His lawyer tried to argue he was mentally ill, But the evidence of planning and premeditation was overwhelming. The jury convicted him on all charges. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison with no parole for at least 15 years. It took more than a year before I felt like myself again. My parents sold the house because none of us could live there after what happened. I changed jobs and started therapy twice a week. I took self-defense classes that helped me feel less powerless. My family grew closer through the shared trauma. Connor moved to Seattle after graduation. I eventually started dating again, though I was extremely careful, running background checks and trusting my instincts in ways I never had before. I started volunteering with a domestic violence organization, sharing my story and advocating for better stalking laws. I learned that restraining orders are often just pieces of paper that can't stop someone truly obsessed. I pushed for legislation requiring better monitoring of stalkers and stricter penalties for violations. I'm 27 now, 18 months after SWAT teams surrounded my childhood home. Damien is in prison where he'll stay for most of his life. I still check locks multiple times and look over my shoulder more than I should. I still have nightmares sometimes where I'm back in that living room with a knife on the table, but I also have genuine moments of happiness and peace that I had to fight to reclaim. My family is safe. I've learned that survival isn't just about getting through the crisis, it's about what you do afterward. I chose to speak up and help others recognize warning signs of obsessive behavior. If you're in a relationship that feels controlling, if someone won't accept your boundaries or makes you afraid, please get help. It doesn't get better on its own. And if you've survived something like this, know that healing is possible even when it feels impossible. Hit that subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. Share this if you think it might help someone recognize danger before it's too late. Trust your instincts, set firm boundaries, and remember that you're stronger than you know.